The year is 867 CE. In the ruins of what was once Northumbria's royal hall, something happened that would echo through centuries of Viking legend. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it with unusual brevity. King Glar was killed by the sons of Ragnar, but a century later Norse poets would describe something far more elaborate. They claimed Glar's executioners carved an eagle into his back, spread his ribs like wings, and pulled his lungs through the opening while he still lived. They called it the Blood Eagle. For over 1,000 years, this image has defined how we understand Viking brutality. Medieval writers invoked it as proof of Norse savagery. Modern films and television series recreate it in graphic detail. The Blood Eagle has become the ultimate symbol of Viking cruelty. The punishment so horrifying it proves these warriors were unlike any other culture in medieval Europe. But here's what most people never learn. We don't actually know if it happened. Not once, not ever. The disconnect between what we believe about the Blood Eagle and what medieval sources actually say reveals something crucial about how history gets written. More importantly, it shows us why certain stories survive while others disappear. To understand what really happened in 867 CE and whether the Blood Eagle was real, we need to examine three things: what the sources actually claim, what was physically possible, and what Viking Age Scandinavians needed people to believe about them. The earliest reference appears in the late 9th century skaldic poem about Ragnar's sons. The poet describes them carving an eagle on glass back. That's it. No ribs, no lungs, just cutting an image into skin. The elaboration came later, in Icelandic sagas written 2 centuries after the events they describe. The Orkninga saga and the tale of Ragnar's sons expand the procedure into the anatomically detailed ritual we recognize today. 2 centuries is a long time. Long enough for oral tradition to transform, for political motivations to reshape narratives, for a simple execution to become legend. The sagas were written in Christian Iceland, by authors with complex relationships to their pagan past. They were creating literature, preserving cultural memory, and often making political arguments about power and legitimacy. But let's assume the later sources preserved accurate tradition. Let's examine whether the Blood Eagle was physically possible. Medieval Scandinavians were skilled in practical anatomy. They butchered animals, treated battle wounds, and understood how bodies worked in concrete, functional ways. They knew what happened when you opened a chest cavity. Modern medical analysis reveals the problems immediately. The human pleural cavity maintains negative pressure. The moment you breach the chest wall, that pressure equals the lungs collapse. You cannot pull collapsed lungs through an opening and have them remain expanded like wings. The victim would lose consciousness within seconds from trauma and blood loss, long before the ritual could be completed as described in the sagas. The anatomical impossibility doesn't prove the Blood Eagle never happened. It proves that if it happened, it didn't look like the sagas describe, which means we're back to the original question. What actually occurred in 867 CE? The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written within decades of Glar's death, says only that he was killed. The Chronicle of Thelwood, another near-contemporary English source, adds no gruesome details. Silence doesn't prove absence, but it is significant that English chroniclers who had every reason to portray Vikings as monsters simply recorded a death. The political context matters here. Glar had allegedly killed Ragnar Lothbrek by throwing him into a pit of snakes. Whether this actually happened is itself disputed, but Viking Age Scandinavians believed it had. Glar's execution wasn't random violence, it was retribution, carried out by sons avenging their father. Revenge killings in medieval Scandinavia followed cultural patterns. They were supposed to be public, witnessed, and proportional to the original offense, but they were also supposed to make political sense. Ragnar's sons weren't just settling a family score in 867, they were conquering a kingdom. They needed Northumbrian cooperation, or at least submission. Excessive brutality toward a defeated king could backfire, turning potential subjects into permanent enemies. Viking leaders understood this calculation. They were pragmatic warriors operating in a complex political environment, not mindless barbarians, so perhaps Glar was simply executed. Perhaps the eagle carved on his back was a mark, not a surgical procedure. Perhaps Norse poets, generations later, elaborated that mark into something more dramatic because the story served cultural purposes that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. The transformation of a possible marking into an elaborate torture ritual tells us something crucial about how medieval Norse culture used violence narratively. The sagas that describe blood eagles weren't historical records, they were literature. Composed in 13th century Iceland by Christian authors looking back at a pagan past they could never fully recover. These authors faced a complex problem. They wanted to preserve their ancestors' reputation for martial prowess while also establishing distance from pagan brutality. The Blood Eagles served both purposes perfectly. It demonstrated Viking warriors were fearsome, capable of acts that terrified enemies, but it also marked them as pagan others, people whose violence exceeded Christian norms. Similar patterns appear throughout saga literature. The sagas describe Viking Age Scandinavians doing things that would have been tactically stupid, legally problematic, or socially destructive in their actual historical context. Not because Vikings were stupid or destructive, but because saga authors were creating dramatic narratives, not documentary records. Consider what we know Vikings actually did. They were traders who established commercial networks from Baghdad to Newfoundland. They were settlers who negotiated land rights and integrated into existing kingdoms. They were warriors who used calculated violence to achieve political goals, not random brutality for its own sake. Archaeological evidence shows Viking Age settlements were prosperous, well-organized communities with sophisticated legal systems and complex social structures. This doesn't mean Vikings weren't violent. Medieval warfare was brutal everywhere. English kings blinded rivals. Frankish nobles tortured enemies. Byzantine emperors mutilated defeated generals. Vikings participated in this widespread medieval violence, but they weren't uniquely savage. They just had better poets. The blood eagle persists in modern imagination because it fits a narrative we've constructed about Vikings. We want them to be different, more primal, closer to some imagined barbaric past. The anatomical impossibility, the silence of near-contemporary sources, and the pattern of saga embellishment all point toward skepticism. The execution was probably public, intended to demonstrate their power and legitimate their conquest of Northumbria. It may have involved marking Gla's body in some way that Norse poets later described as an eagle. It became shorthand for Viking ferocity, a single image that could convey everything medieval and modern audiences wanted to believe about Norse warriors. Once established in saga tradition, it was repeatedly invoked in other contexts, applied to other victims, expanded and refined until it achieved the detailed form we recognize today. This pattern of elaboration is visible in the sources themselves. They were skilled navigators who reached North America centuries before Columbus. They were adaptable settlers who founded Dublin, ruled parts of England, and integrated into Frankish society. They were poets whose verses survived centuries of oral transmission. But it tells us everything about what later cultures needed them to be. Modern audiences need Vikings who confirm our assumptions about progress from barbarism to civilization. The image endures because it serves purposes that have nothing to do with historical truth. It persists not because it happened, but because we want it to have happened. That desire, more than any 9th century execution, deserves our attention. King Glad died in 867 CE. How he died remains uncertain. That uncertainty is the most historically accurate answer we can give. Sometimes the honest response to history's questions is simply, we don't know, and we should be more comfortable saying it.